Ethan arrived at the Grand Music Academy on a cold morning. Carrying a small suitcase and a worn-out backpack, the huge building looked like a palace to him. Marble floors, shining stairs, and the sound of piano notes echoing from distant rooms. He stood near the entrance for a moment, watching students walk by in polished shoes and expensive coats. They all seemed to know each other, laughing, talking, and greeting the teachers confidently. Ethan felt out of place. His clothes were plain, his shoes slightly torn, and his old shirt had been washed too many times. When he handed his admission papers to the receptionist, she looked at him with a faint smile. "You're the scholarship student, right?" she asked politely. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her smile stayed, but her eyes moved away quickly, as if she had already decided he wouldn't last long here. He thanked her softly and went toward his new classroom. The hallway smelled of polish and old books. He could hear a group of students practicing their instruments, some playing fast scales, others performing soft, dreamy tunes. When Ethan entered the class, all eyes turned toward him. The students paused for a second, scanning the newcomer from head to toe. One girl whispered something to another and giggled. The teacher, Mr. Lawrence, a tall man with silver hair and sharp glasses, looked up from his notes. "Ah, you must be the new student," he said. "Ethan Cole, right?" Ethan nodded again and quietly took the empty seat near the back. Throughout the class, Ethan stayed silent. The others played confidently when called to the front, showing off their skills and polished techniques. When it was Ethan's turn, he walked to the piano with slow steps. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys. He began to play a simple piece, one he had learned years ago on a broken old piano from his town's library. The sound was not perfect. One or two notes slipped, and a soft chuckle rose from the back of the room. Mr. Lawrence frowned but said nothing. Ethan finished quietly, his cheeks warm from embarrassment after class. He gathered his books and started to leave, but he heard one boy whisper loudly, "I guess the academy takes anyone these days." The others laughed. Ethan didn't reply. He just walked out, pretending not to hear, but his heart felt heavy. The laughter followed him down the corridor like an echo he couldn't escape. Outside, he sat on a bench near the garden and took a deep breath. He looked up at the tall academy windows. Hearing the faint sound of another piano being played perfectly, it reminded him how far he had to go later that evening. Ethan walked back to the small room he rented near the academy. It was barely big enough for a bed and a table, but it was quiet. In the corner stood his old keyboard, a cheap second-hand one with a few broken keys. He turned it on and began to play again, slowly, carefully, fixing every mistake he had made earlier. His fingers were tired, but his heart was steady. He kept practicing, whispering to himself, "I'll get better." As days passed, Ethan noticed how the others treated him. They didn't insult him directly anymore, but their smiles were sharp, and their kindness was cold during lunch breaks. They would sit together while Ethan ate alone. He didn't mind. He wasn't there to make friends. He had come for something else, to prove that talent didn't come from money, that real music lived inside the heart. One day, while Ethan was waiting outside the rehearsal hall, he overheard two students talking to Mr. Lawrence. "Sir, do we really need to include that boy in our group performance?" One of them said. "He slows us down." The teacher replied calmly, "Everyone deserves a chance." But Ethan could hear the hesitation in his voice. He walked away quietly before they noticed him. That night he made a promise to himself. He would practice until his music spoke louder than their laughter. Until the director, the teachers, and every student who doubted him had no choice but to listen. Every evening when the academy closed, Ethan stayed behind in the shadows of the practice hall. Sometimes, he would sneak into the empty piano room after the janitor left. He sat there for hours, repeating scales, learning pieces he found in old books. His fingers began to move faster, his touch softer. The piano, once intimidating, now felt like a friend still. The doubt from others lingered. During one of the morning classes, the director, a tall man known for his harsh judgments, visited. He stood near the piano and asked the students to play one by one. When Ethan's turn came, he could feel everyone watching him. The director looked at him and said in a firm voice, "Let's see what the scholarship boy can do." The words were meant to test him. Ethan started playing, but his nerves betrayed him. He hit the wrong note, and laughter filled the air again. The director sighed. "Music is not for everyone." "Son," Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded and stepped away. That evening, He sat in his small room again, staring at his keyboard. His hands hovered above the keys. He felt shame and anger twist inside him. But then he remembered his father's words before he left home. Don't let them tell you what you can't do. Son, let your music answer for you. Slowly, Ethan began to play and the sound filled the empty room. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. As the night grew darker, his fear began to fade. The music wrapped around him like warmth. He knew the road ahead was long, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He would return to that grand piano, not as the boy they laughed at, but as the musician who would make them all listen, and though the world around him doubted his worth. Deep inside, Ethan knew one thing. He belonged there, even if no one believed it yet. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, long before the academy gates opened. The city streets were quiet, the sky pale blue, and the smell of fresh bread floated from the bakery nearby. He walked with his small bag of sheet music clutched tightly in his hands. He had hardly slept the night before, his mind replaying the laughter, the director's cold words, and the wrong notes that had betrayed him. But beneath that pain burned something sharper, determination. He promised himself that today would be different. When he entered the academy, a group of students were already gathered near the main hall, chatting about their upcoming performances. Their voices echoed off the marble walls. Did you hear? One said. The director invited a famous pianist to visit next week. Only the best students will get to play in front of him. Another added proudly. Ethan listened silently, knowing no one expected him to be part of that list. As he walked past, one boy named Lucas called out, Hey, scholarship boy, maybe you can carry our music stands. Since you're not performing, the group burst into laughter. Ethan stopped but didn't look back. His hands tightened around his papers. He kept walking, pretending not to hear. The humiliation stung, but he let it burn quietly inside him like fuel. Inside the rehearsal room, Mr. Lawrence was giving feedback to each student. Too rushed, slow down, he said to one. Good phrasing, but more feeling, to another. When it was Ethan's turn, he played carefully, his fingers steady. Trying not to repeat yesterday's mistakes, the melody came out smooth but simple. After he finished, the teacher sighed. Ethan, your technique is improving, but your music lacks emotion, he said. It's clean, but it doesn't speak. You have to make people feel. Those words stayed in Ethan's mind all day. How could he make people feel? He didn't have their expensive instruments, private tutors, or family connections. All he had were memories, the sound of the rain on his roof at night, the rhythm of his mother's humming while cooking, the echo of church bells that had inspired him to play. Maybe, he thought, emotion came not from perfection, but from truth. After classes ended, he walked toward the practice hall again. The janitor, the same old man who had seen him before, was sweeping the floor. You again? He said with a small smile. Ethan nodded. Just for an hour. Sir? The man chuckled. You said that yesterday too. He left the lights on and closed the door behind him. Ethan sat at the grand piano and took a deep breath. He placed his hands gently on the keys, but this time, he didn't open his sheet music. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to play from memory. The sound was soft at first, uncertain, then it grew richer and deeper. Every note carried something from inside him. The loneliness, the embarrassment, the small hopes that refused to die. The melody began to form into something haunting and new. He didn't even know what he was creating. He just played, letting his heart lead. The moonlight from the window fell across the keys, turning the piano silver under his hands. Hours passed without him noticing. His body was tired, but his spirit felt lighter. For the first time, the music sounded like his own, not borrowed from a book or copied from another composer. Suddenly, a sound startled him, a soft clap from the doorway. Ethan turned quickly and saw the janitor standing there. Didn't mean to scare you, son, the man said gently. But that was something special. Ethan smiled shyly. Thank you, sir, it's nothing, just practice. The old man shook his head. No, boy, that wasn't just practice. You played like someone who's been holding something in for years. Ethan laughed quietly. Maybe I have, he said. The janitor leaned on his broom and added, You know, music doesn't care about who laughs at you. It only listens to those who keep playing. His words hit Ethan deeply. From that night onward, Ethan's routine changed. Every day he attended classes quietly. Every night he returned to the piano after everyone had left. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore. Each note became part of his journey, from humiliation to strength, From silence to voice one evening, as he was finishing another piece, he didn't realize that someone else had been listening outside the door. It was Mr. Lawrence, the teacher. He had forgotten his papers and heard the music drifting through the hallway. When Ethan finally stopped, the teacher stepped inside. "Ethan," he said softly. "That was beautiful. What were you playing?" Ethan froze. I don't know, sir. I just played what I felt, mister." Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. "You just proved what I told you this morning. Music doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful." He walked to the piano and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Keep working on that piece. I want you to play it for the director next week." Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. "The director?" "Yes," the teacher smiled faintly. "Let them hear the boy they laughed at." That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He replayed the conversation in his mind over and over. For the first time since he arrived at the academy, he felt something strange. Hope? He wasn't sure what the next performance would bring. But he knew one thing clearly now. He wasn't going to run from the laughter anymore. He was going to answer it not with words, but with music. As dawn broke, he sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the rooftops. The city slowly came alive with noise, but in his heart, there was only quiet determination. The boy they mocked was gone. In his place sat a musician, still unknown, still unpolished, but burning with purpose. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Let them laugh again. I'll make them listen next time." Then he turned back to his keyboard, fingers ready to begin again. The week leading up to the director's showcase was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The academy buzzed with nervous excitement. Students practiced endlessly, each determined to impress the famous guest pianist who was coming to judge their performances. Everywhere Ethan went, he heard fragments of melodies echoing from rooms. Sharp, confident and showy. But his own tune was different, softer and deeper. Like a quiet story whispered under the noise, he spent every spare moment at the piano, polishing the piece that had grown from his heart. It wasn't written on paper, but lived in his memory, a blend of everything he had felt since stepping into the academy. Pain, hope, defiance, and beauty. He named it the Quiet Storm. The janitor often found him there, lost in the music. "You're not practicing anymore," the old man said one night. "You're living it." Ethan smiled. Maybe that's what I was meant to do. During the day, things were harder. The other students noticed that Ethan seemed more focused, more confident, and it irritated them. Lucas especially didn't like the change. He had always been the star student, polished, handsome, admired by teachers, but now, the scholarship boy he used to mock was suddenly the teacher's favorite. "You really think he's going to play for the director?" Lucas sneered to his friends. "He'll freeze before he finishes the first bar." The group laughed, but there was a flicker of doubt in Lucas's eyes. That evening, as Ethan entered the practice room, he found Lucas waiting there, leaning against the piano. "You've been getting a lot of attention lately," Lucas said casually. "Must feel good, huh?" Ethan nodded politely. "I'm just trying to do my best," Lucas smirked. "Well, maybe your best won't be enough." He walked over to the piano and pressed one key. A jarring, wrong note. "You see, this isn't about feeling. It's about perfection." Ethan said nothing, just looked at the keyboard. "You'll understand that when you fail," Lucas added. Before leaving with a smirk, the words stung, but they didn't break him. Ethan sat at the piano long after everyone left, replaying his melody over and over until dawn. His fingers hurt, but he didn't stop. Each repetition made it stronger, clearer, and more alive. The morning of the showcase arrived with cold rain outside. The academy's grand hall glowed with golden lights. Rows of chairs lined the space, filled with teachers, students, and the director himself, the guest pianist. A tall man with white hair and kind eyes sat beside him. Ethan watched from backstage as each student performed. Their music was brilliant, complex, almost perfect, but something about it felt hollow, like paint without color. When Ethan's name was called, a murmur spread across the hall. Some whispered, others chuckled softly. "Let's see how he embarrasses himself this time," Lucas said quietly from the side. Ethan took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the piano. Every step echoed in his chest like a drum beat. His heart raced, but his face stayed calm. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and for a moment did nothing. The director sighed impatiently. "Well, Mr. Cole?" Ethan looked up and said softly, "I just needed a second to listen." Then he began. The first note was delicate, trembling like a raindrop hitting glass. The next flowed after it, slow and tender soon. The melody began to grow, carrying emotion like a rising wave. It was not flawless. A few notes slipped, but they didn't matter. Each sound held a truth. The audience, once restless, began to lean forward. The guest pianist's eyes softened. The director's frown faded. The music painted pictures of a lonely boy sitting by a cracked window, of laughter that once hurt, of nights spent in silence and stubborn hope. It rose and fell, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, until it felt as though the entire hall was breathing with him. When he reached the middle part, Ethan poured everything he had left into the keys. His fingers moved faster, the rhythm tightening like a heartbeat. His eyes closed, but he could see it all. Every night of struggle, every whispered insult, every quiet promise to himself. And then came the final part, a whispering, fading tune, like the world exhaling after a storm. The last note hung in the air, trembling before dissolving into silence. No one moved. The sound of the rain outside had stopped. The hall felt sacred. Ethan sat still, his hands resting on the keys, afraid to break the moment. Then, from somewhere near the front, the guest pianist began to clap. Slowly, others followed, until the room filled with applause. Not polite or forced, but real, powerful, and long. The director rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. He walked toward Ethan, each step echoing louder than the claps. "What was that piece?" he asked quietly. Ethan swallowed. "It doesn't have a name, sir." "Who wrote it?" "I did," Ethan said. The director paused, his eyes softening. "Then you just reminded us what music truly means." The applause grew louder, and some students who had once mocked him now stood awkwardly. Clapping with red faces, Lucas looked down, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. Later that night, after everyone had left, Ethan returned to the piano. He touched the keys gently as if thanking them. The janitor entered quietly, carrying his broom. "Heard you silenced the whole hall, son," he said with a grin. Ethan smiled. They stopped laughing. The old man nodded. "Told you, music listens to those who don't give up." Ethan looked at the piano one last time before leaving. His reflection shimmered faintly on its polished surface. He realized that the laughter, the doubt, the pain, it had all been necessary. Without them, there would be no melody, no truth, no victory. And as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The next morning, the academy hallways buzzed with whispers about what had happened the night before. Some students spoke in awe, others in jealousy, but everyone agreed on one thing. Ethan's performance had changed something. The laughter that once followed him was gone, replaced by glances of respect, curiosity, and even fear. The quiet boy from nowhere had done the impossible. When Ethan walked through the corridor, people moved aside. They didn't speak, but their silence said more than words. He could still feel their stares burning on his back. A few smiled at him awkwardly, trying to act friendly, but Ethan simply nodded and kept walking. He wasn't angry. He had learned that silence could speak louder than revenge. In class, Mr. Lawrence announced the results. "As you all know," he began, "our guest judge was deeply impressed by last night's performances, but one stood above the rest." He paused, letting the tension rise. "Mr. Ethan Cole." The room erupted in soft applause, though a few hands clapped half-heartedly. Lucas stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Ethan's heart raced. But he stayed humble. He only whispered, "Thank you, sir." Later that day, as Ethan was leaving the building, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Lucas. "Congratulations," he said coldly. "Looks like the director finally noticed his charity case." Ethan turned to face him, his voice calm. "It wasn't charity, Lucas. It was music," Lucas smirked. "Keep telling yourself that," and walked away. His pride had taken a wound it couldn't hide. But the director had noticed more than just Ethan's performance. That afternoon, Ethan was called to his office. The room was lined with trophies, framed pictures, and shelves filled with thick music scores. The director sat behind a grand wooden desk. His tone was measured. "Ethan, sit down." Ethan obeyed quietly. "You surprised everyone last night," the director continued. "Your playing was raw, honest. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I like that." Ethan didn't know how to respond. "Thank you, sir." "Yes, you," the director replied. "Don't waste the gift you've been given." When Ethan left the office, his heart was pounding. It felt like a dream. The winter concert was one of the most prestigious events in the academy, a stage where only the best performed. But along with the excitement came pressure. Could he do it again? Could he create something even greater than before? That night, Ethan sat at his small keyboard. The rain outside tapped against the window like a metronome. He played a few chords, listening carefully, but no melody came. His mind was blank. He stared at his fingers, feeling the fear creeping back. What if the first time had been luck? What if he didn't have another masterpiece inside him? Days passed and the pressure grew. Teachers began to prepare their top students for the concert. Lucas, of course, was one of them. He practiced for hours, his pieces sharp and complex. But his pride was darker now one afternoon. He walked past Ethan's room and heard nothing. Only silence. Lost your touch already? He muttered before leaving. But Ethan wasn't idle. He spent his evenings walking through the city, listening to the sounds of life, the rhythm of footsteps, the hum of streetlights, the laughter of children, and the cries of vendors. He began to hear music in everything. Slowly, ideas returned. He rushed home and began to play again, this time not from frustration, but from observation. Each sound became a note, each feeling a melody. One night, as he worked on the final section, the janitor appeared again, watching quietly from the doorway. "You don't rest much, do you?" the old man said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Music doesn't rest either." The janitor chuckled. "And what will you call this one?" Ethan paused, his fingers still moving across the keys. "Maybe Second Breath," he said, "because it feels like I'm finally breathing again." The janitor nodded slowly. "You found your rhythm, son, but remember, music isn't just about the notes, it's about the silence between them." Ethan looked up. Unsure what he meant, the old man just smiled. "You'll understand it on stage." As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's new composition began to take shape. It was bigger, bolder, but also more vulnerable. It carried everything he had learned since his first day. Every humiliation, every small victory, and every quiet night spent alone with the piano. The melody rose like hope and fell like memory. When Mr. Lawrence heard it for the first time, he stood silent for a long time before saying, "Ethan, this piece doesn't just show skill, it shows your soul." Ethan lowered his eyes humbly. "Do you think it's ready for the concert?" "It's more than ready," the teacher replied. "It's something people will remember." As the winter concert approached, the academy prepared itself for its grandest night. Posters with Ethan's name appeared in the hallway. Students practiced harder than ever. Some admired him, others resented him, Lucas most of all. He had planned to close the concert with his own performance. But now Ethan had been given the final slot, the one reserved for the best. The night before the event, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by his piano, playing the opening notes again and again. His hands trembled, but not from fear and from anticipation. Outside, snow began to fall quietly. The city was asleep, but Ethan's music was awake, weaving through the cold air. The melody that started from pain had grown into something pure, something powerful. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the room. In that moment, he didn't care about trophies, applause, or recognition. He only cared that his music, his truth, would be heard. And as the final note faded into the silence of the night, Ethan whispered softly, "Tomorrow, they'll understand who I really am." The day of the winter concert dawned bright and cold. Snowflakes drifted past the academy windows like silent applause from the sky. Inside, the grand hall glittered with chandeliers, polished instruments, and rows of guests dressed in their finest. The atmosphere was electric, the kind of charged excitement that only great performances could create. Ethan stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from the weight of everything he had lived through to reach this moment. He could hear the orchestra tuning their instruments, the hum of the audience, and the clicking of heels across the marble floor. Mr. Lawrence approached, resting a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "It's your night, son," he said gently. "Don't think about the people out there. Play for the music, and let it carry you." Ethan nodded silently, his heart pounding like a quiet drum. The concert began, one by one. The academy's top students performed, filling the hall with flawless, elegant music. Lucas was among them, his fingers racing across the piano keys with machine-like precision. The audience clapped loudly when he finished, and Lucas glanced toward the backstage curtain, smirking. For him, it was a statement: perfection against passion, technique against truth. Then the director stood, announcing the final performance of the night. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our closing piece will be performed by one of our most promising students, Mr. Ethan Cole, presenting his original composition, Second Breath." The audience clapped politely. Curious but skeptical, few had forgotten that he was once the boy they had laughed at. Ethan walked out slowly, his black suit simple but neat. The stage lights blinded him for a moment, and he could barely make out the sea of faces. He bowed slightly and took his seat at the grand piano. The room grew still. The air felt heavy with expectation. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered under his breath, "Let them hear the truth." The first note broke the silence, soft and delicate like the sound of snow landing on glass. Then came another and another, weaving together into a gentle melody. It carried warmth even in the cold air. The audience leaned in, drawn closer by its honesty. Unlike the polished perfection of others, Ethan's music was alive, breathing. Trembling and human as the melody grew, Ethan's body moved with it. His hands danced across the keys, sometimes firm, sometimes tender. Every rise and fall told a part of his story. The laughter, the humiliation, the long nights of practice, and the quiet strength that had grown from it. The music built like a storm, gathering power, emotion, and memory. The once polite audience was now silent, captivated in the middle section. The tone changed. It became darker, heavier. Filled with struggle, the notes clashed briefly before resolving, symbolizing the pain he had faced. Tears welled in the eyes of a few listeners who didn't even understand why. The music seemed to speak directly to the soul, reminding them of their own buried wounds and forgotten dreams. The director, sitting in the front row, leaned forward, his hand on his chin. His face softened, and for a brief second, he was no longer the strict critic. He was simply a man moved by art. Then came the final section. Ethan lifted his hands and paused for a heartbeat. The hall was so quiet he could hear his own breathing. He pressed the keys again, and the melody rose like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't about pain anymore, it was about release, forgiveness and rebirth. The last notes floated through the air, shimmering before fading into silence. No one moved for a long, perfect moment. The hall held its breath, then suddenly, someone stood and clapped, one person, then another. Then the entire audience rose to their feet. The applause thundered through the room, echoing off the high ceilings like waves. Ethan stood, bowing deeply, his heart full. Mr. Lawrence was the first to reach him backstage, wrapping him in a proud embrace. "You did it, Ethan," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You didn't just play music, you made them feel again." Ethan smiled, still dazed. "I just played what I lived." The director approached next, his expression thoughtful but kind. "That was extraordinary," he said. "You have a rare gift, one that no amount of training can create." He paused, then added, "I'd like to offer you a mentorship under our visiting pianist, if you're willing." Ethan blinked in disbelief. I'd be honored." "Sir?" The director smiled faintly. "Good. Let's begin shaping your future." As Ethan turned, he noticed Lucas standing in the corner. His face pale, his usual confidence was gone. Replaced by quiet defeat, he gave a small nod. Not of friendship, but of acknowledgement. Ethan nodded back. It was enough that night. After the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, Ethan returned to the empty stage. The piano sat there, waiting in the quiet glow of the chandelier. He ran his fingers across the keys one last time and played a few soft notes. They echoed gently in the vast silence, a whisper of everything that had happened. The janitor entered, leaning on his broom. "You did it again, boy," he said with a grin. Ethan laughed softly. "I think the music did it." The old man nodded. "Aye, maybe it did, but it needed your hands." Ethan looked around the hall, remembering how it once seemed too grand, too distant. Now it felt like home. He sat there for a while, lost in the warmth of accomplishment, realizing that success wasn't about applause or awards. It was about finding his voice and daring to let the world hear it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. The boy who once trembled before the piano had become the musician who silenced the world with truth. His melody lingered in the air, long after he had left the stage. Weeks passed after the winter concert, yet the echo of Ethan's performance still drifted through the academy like a legend. Students spoke of that night in hushed voices, replaying the moment when his melody had silenced the hall. Posters of the concert hung on bulletin boards, and beneath them someone had scribbled, "The boy who played from his soul." Ethan's life changed quietly, not with sudden fame, but with steady recognition. Teachers who once overlooked him now greeted him warmly. Classmates asked for help with their music, and the director treated him as an equal. But despite the praise, Ethan remained humble. He still walked the same halls with the same soft smile, still wore his simple clothes, still practiced late into the night. For him, the applause was never the goal. It was the sound of being understood. The mentorship with the visiting pianist, Maestro Alaric, began soon after. The man was known worldwide, sharp, precise, and intimidating. His lessons were intense, sometimes brutal. "Emotion is not enough," Alaric would say. "A storm without control destroys its own beauty." Ethan listened carefully, trying to balance passion with discipline. The maestro would strike the keys sharply and demand, "Again." But this time make the silence between notes mean something. Ethan struggled. Many nights he left the room exhausted, hands aching, heart unsure. But each challenge pushed him further. Alaric saw in him something rare, not just talent, but truth. "You have something money can't buy," he told Ethan one evening. "You've suffered, and you turned that into sound. Never lose that. But learn to shape it." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's music deepened. He began to compose pieces that blended Alaric's precision with his own raw emotion. Word of his progress spread beyond the academy one afternoon. The director entered the practice hall with surprising news. "Ethan," he said, "there's an invitation for you." He handed him a letter embossed with gold. It was from the National Youth Symphony Competition, one of the most prestigious events in the country. "They want you to perform your original work," the director added proudly. Ethan froze, his mind raced. "Me? Perform there?" "Yes," the director smiled. "You've earned it, son. This is your next stage." That night, Ethan sat by his window, the city glowing below. The competition would be held in a month, and the thought both thrilled and terrified him. He knew the crowd would be larger, the judges stricter, the pressure heavier, but deep inside he also felt ready. He began working on a new piece, something grander than Second Breath, a composition that would capture everything he'd learned. He called it Echoes of Dawn because to him it symbolized rising after darkness. Each night he played until the stars faded, shaping every sound like a painter shaping light. The janitor still passed by sometimes, watching through the doorway. "Still chasing the stars, eh?" He'd joke. Ethan would smile. "Maybe I'm just trying to catch one." One evening, as Ethan was playing, Lucas appeared in the doorway. He hadn't spoken to Ethan since the concert. "You're really leaving us behind, huh?" he said quietly. Ethan turned, surprised by his tone. "I'm not leaving anyone, Lucas. I'm just following where music takes me." Lucas looked down. "I used to think you didn't belong here, but I was wrong." His voice was low, sincere. "When you played that night, I realized I've been chasing perfection, not purpose." Ethan smiled gently. "We all start somewhere. You taught me something too. That pride without heart is just noise." Lucas gave a small laugh. "Maybe one day we'll play together. Maybe one day." "We will," Ethan replied. They shook hands for the first time, not as rivals but as musicians. The competition day arrived faster than Ethan expected. The National Auditorium was massive, its ceiling soaring like a cathedral. Famous musicians, critics, and conductors filled the seats backstage. Ethan waited, his sheet music trembling slightly in his hands. Maestro Alaric approached, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Remember," he said, "don't play to impress them. Play to remind them what it means to feel." Ethan nodded, those words sinking deep into his heart. When his turn came, he stepped onto the stage. The lights felt warmer than before, the silence thicker. He sat at the grand piano and closed his eyes, taking one deep breath. The first note rang out, soft, golden, alive. Echoes of Dawn began like a sunrise, slow and tender. Then it grew brighter, stronger. The melody carried traces of his past, the loneliness, the laughter, the quiet nights of struggle, but it also carried something new, peace, forgiveness, and confidence. Each note was a bridge between who he was and who he had become. The audience was spellbound. Even the strictest judges leaned forward. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent, not out of confusion, but reverence then like a wave breaking. The applause erupted, roaring and endless. Ethan stood, bowing deeply, his chest tight with emotion. Backstage, Maestro Alaric's eyes glistened. "You did it, boy," he said. "You made them listen." The director embraced him. "You've carried our academy higher than ever before." That night, Ethan didn't celebrate loudly. Instead, he found a quiet corner outside the hall, looking up at the stars. He thought about where it all began: the laughter, the mistakes, the old piano in his small room, the janitor who believed in him every sound. Every scar had shaped his melody. As the wind brushed his face, he whispered, "Maybe music isn't about winning or losing. Maybe it's about remembering why you started." He smiled softly, knowing this was not the end of his journey, but a new beginning, the dawn after every silence, the echo that would never fade. The morning after the competition, Ethan woke to the sound of church bells echoing through the city. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The sunlight streamed through the hotel curtains, warm and golden. He sat up slowly, realizing that everything felt unreal. The applause, the lights, the smiles, the handshake from Maestro Alaric. It wasn't a dream, but it felt like one. On the bedside table lay the small silver trophy with his name engraved. Ethan Cole, winner, National Youth Symphony Competition. He picked it up and turned it in his hands, watching the light reflect off its surface a few years ago. He couldn't have imagined standing on a national stage, let alone winning it. Back then he was just a boy with an old keyboard, mocked for dreaming too big, and yet here he was, holding proof that the laughter hadn't defined him. His perseverance had. Later that day, Ethan returned to the academy. As soon as he entered the main hall, students turned their heads, some cheered, others clapped. The director himself came forward, shaking his hand with pride. "You've done more than win a trophy, Ethan," he said. "You've given this academy its soul back," Mr. Lawrence added with a smile. "And you reminded us all why we became teachers." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say, so he simply bowed slightly and whispered, "Thank you." Even Lucas was there, standing quietly at the back. When the crowd dispersed, he approached. "You really did it," he said softly. "You changed everything," Ethan smiled. "No, Lucas. I just stopped running from who I am," Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "You're still humble, huh?" "Only because pride never taught me anything," Ethan replied. They both laughed, a sound that no longer carried tension. Just respect, but not everything changed overnight. The academy still had its share of competition, jealousy, and ambition. Only now, Ethan stood apart, not because he was better, but because he had learned that greatness didn't come from winning, it came from meaning. He continued practicing every day, mentoring younger students who reminded him of himself. One of those students was a shy girl named Mia. She would often peek through the door as he practiced. One day, Ethan invited her in. "You play, don't you?" he asked kindly. She nodded nervously. "A little." "Then play," Ethan said. Gesturing toward the piano, her hands trembled as she sat down. Missing a few notes, Ethan waited patiently. And when she stopped, he smiled. "That's a start. Don't worry about mistakes, worry about silence. That's where the music hides." From that day, Mia began visiting regularly, slowly growing more confident. Ethan realized something new. Teaching gave him the same joy as performing. Watching others discover their voice felt like reliving his own journey. The janitor, now fondly called Mr. Ben by everyone, would sometimes watch from the doorway and say, "Looks like the teacher's become the master, huh?" Ethan would grin. Maybe just someone passing the light forward. Months passed, and Maestro Alaric prepared to leave the academy to continue his world tour. On his last day, he called Ethan to his office. "I've taught hundreds of students," the maestro said, "but only a few remind me why I teach. You are one of them. I want you to come with me, to train under me abroad." Ethan's heart raced. "Abroad?" "Yes," Alaric said. "Europe, concerts, real stages, real audiences." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. An open door to the world of professional music. But as he looked around the familiar academy, he thought of Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Ben, Lucas, and little Mia. He thought of the dusty practice rooms, the nights filled with his first uncertain melodies, and the echoes of laughter that had once shaped him. He finally said softly, "Maestro, I'm honored. Truly. But not yet. I still have something to finish here." Alaric studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then I'll wait for you. Music will wait too." After the maestro left, Ethan stood by the piano for a long time, running his fingers along the keys. He realized that success wasn't about how far he could go, but how many lives his music could touch along the way. The academy had once been a place of fear for him. Now it was home. That evening, the director called for a small celebration. Teachers, students, and staff gathered in the hall. They raised glasses of sparkling juice and toasted to the boy who had changed their academy. "To Ethan," Mr. Lawrence said, "who taught us that even silence can sing." The crowd cheered, and Ethan felt warmth rise in his chest. Later, when the hall was empty, he sat alone at the piano one last time. Snowflakes began to fall outside again, just like the night of his first triumph. He played softly, the melody of Second Breath, the song that had started it all. But this time it sounded different, fuller. "Eyes are peaceful." Ben entered quietly, leaning on his broom. "Still playing, huh?" Ethan smiled. "Can't stop now." The old man chuckled. "Don't ever stop, boy. Some people spend their lives searching for their sound. You found yours." Ethan looked up at him. "Maybe it was always there. I just had to believe in it." As the final note faded into the quiet hall, Ethan sat back listening to the echo. It was soft, but alive, like a promise carried by time. He knew his journey wasn't over. There would be new stages, new struggles, new melodies to write, but for now he was content. The laughter was gone, replaced by harmony. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, covering the academy rooftops in white inside. Ethan's music lingered in the air, a song born of pain, turned into hope and destined to live far beyond him. Years later, the academy had changed, but the legend of Ethan Cole had not faded. His story had become part of its very walls, whispered to new students as both warning and inspiration. "He came here with nothing," they said, and left a legacy that still plays through the halls. His picture now hung near the grand piano, the same one he had once feared to touch. Beneath it were engraved the words he once told Mia. "Don't worry about mistakes. Worry about silence." Ethan was no longer the timid scholarship boy. He had grown into a man known across countries, performing in the grandest concert halls. His compositions, Second Breath, Echoes of Dawn, and The Quiet Storm, were played by orchestras and piano prodigies around the world. Critics wrote about the way his music made audiences cry without knowing why. They said his melodies carried truth, something rare, something human, but despite the fame, Ethan stayed the same quiet soul. He still woke early, still practiced alone before dawn, still carried the humility of his beginnings. Every time his fingers touched the keys, he remembered the small room, the cracked keyboard, the laughter of those who doubted him, and the old janitor who had said, "Music listens to those who don't give up." One winter morning, years after his rise to fame, Ethan returned to the academy unannounced. He wore a long black coat and carried a small leather case. Snow dusted his shoulders as he stepped inside. The halls were quieter now, but the smell of old wood polish and faint piano notes still filled the air. It felt like stepping back into his own memory. The receptionist, a young student, looked up and gasped, You're Mr. Cole." Ethan smiled. "Just Ethan, please." She rushed to inform the director, who hurried out with a wide grin. "We didn't know you were coming," he exclaimed. Ethan chuckled softly. "Neither did I just missed the sound of this place." They led him to the auditorium. Empty but still majestic, dust sparkled in the sunlight streaming through tall windows. The same piano sat on stage, the same one where it all began. Ethan walked slowly toward it, his steps echoing softly. When he reached it, he ran his hand along the polished surface. "Hello, old friend," he whispered. He sat down and pressed a single key. The note rang clear, strong, alive. His fingers began to move naturally, playing a tune no one had ever heard before. It was gentle, nostalgic, full of warmth and longing. Soon, a few students passing by peeked in through the door, whispering, "It's him. He's playing, one by one." They filled the seats, listening in silence. Ethan played without looking up. The music told his whole journey. The boy who was mocked. The man who rose. The artist who never forgot where he started. The melody grew, filled the room, and wrapped around every listener like light. When he finally finished, the hall stayed still. The only sound was the faint hum of the last vibrating note. Then a small pair of hands clapped softly from the front row. It was Mia, now older, confident, and carrying her own sheet music. "I knew you'd come back," she said with a smile. Ethan laughed. "I told you I couldn't stop playing." She walked up to the piano and placed her hand on the keys. "Play with me?" she asked. Ethan nodded. Together they began to play, her melody weaving with his, blending the teacher and the student, the past and the present. The director and teachers stood in the doorway. Watching silently for a moment, the academy felt alive again. Not just with music, but with meaning. The students who listened didn't realize they were witnessing something special. Not a concert, but a circle closing. When they finished, the room erupted in applause. Ethan stood and looked around, smiling at all the faces, eager, bright, full of the same fire he once carried. "Don't chase applause," he told them softly. "Chase truth. Music is not about being heard. It's about making someone feel less alone." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the hall emptied, Ethan sat alone again at the piano. The snow outside glowed orange under the fading light. He thought of everyone who had shaped his story. Mr. Lawrence, Maestro Alaric, Lucas, Mia, and old Mr. Ben. He wished they could all hear how far their kindness had carried him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, placing it gently on the piano. Inside was a handwritten letter to the academy, and a donation, enough to build a new music wing, he wrote, for every student who was told they weren't enough, so they can find their own voice. Before leaving, Ethan played one last time, the soft, familiar tune of Second Breath, the same melody that had once silenced laughter. Now echoing through the halls like a heartbeat, the final notes lingered, trembling like snowflakes in the air, and when they faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of peace, of everything he had ever been. As he stepped outside, the snow fell heavier. Covering his footprints, the city lights flickered like stars. And in that quiet moment, Ethan smiled to himself. He no longer needed a stage or applause. His music had already become part of the world, part of every heart it had ever touched. And somewhere inside the academy, the piano still glowed faintly under the light, holding the sound of a boy who once sat there trembling and grew into the man who taught the world how silence could sing.